Many metalheads have asked themselves the question, why did Metallica get so popular when other arguably better and more talented bands did not? And in this video, I'm not going to rehash the history of Metallica because that's been absolutely done to death. Instead, I'm going to be going over the 3 keys that led to Metallica's unrivaled popularity. So be sure to stick around until the end, and maybe you can use these 3 keys to influence some success into your own life. Now, before you go spouting off about they sold out to play everything in 4/4 and they don't use the Fibonacci sequence to write all their music, it's a lot more complex than that. I mean, if that were truly the case, then their older music wouldn't be as popular as it is. Because of course Enter Sandman is a basic quote-unquote song, but songs like One and Orion and Master of Puppets and Fade to Black and much more aren't nearly as basic as some would initially think in their structure, but they're still incredibly popular. And while bands like Exodus and Slayer were playing small clubs and shows of maybe a few hundred people, Metallica were selling out 3,000 to 5,000 person venues and getting the opportunity to tour with larger bands. They had something from the beginning that other bands didn't. Their sound was always more advanced, more heavy, crispier, crunchier, while everyone else was loose and hollow in their production. They always set the pace for what was to come, and everyone fell in line. I mean, look at something like Kill 'Em All. That was the heaviest, the fastest, the most intense music that anyone had ever heard in their life. But it was catchy, it was groovy, and it was state of the art in 1982 and 3 when this music was just starting to come out. Their music was so unique and it took everyone by storm. They started touring with new wave of British heavy metal band Saxon before even recording their first demo. People ate it up, and after seeing how well Metallica was faring, the thrash scene started to explode, and it seemed like everyone and their mom started copying what Metallica was doing. And that leads to the first key in Metallica's popularity. They were innovators. They truly birthed thrash into what it would become. They were the first true thrash metal act, and it all exploded from them. And this concept of innovation would come to define their careers, going on to collaborate with symphony orchestras and other artists like Lou Reed and Lady Gaga. Not to mention, they were the first band to play live shows on all 7 continents in 1 year. Yeah, that means they were the first band to play a show in Antarctica, where they infamously didn't play Trapped Under Ice. And when thrash started to become bland and boring, with hundreds of bands trying to replicate what Metallica had done, they pushed their music to the next level on And Justice for All and the Black Album. An album like And Justice for All really set the stage for progressive metal, a genre that would blow up in the 90s, and it can be argued that And Justice for All was one of the first big prog metal albums. And the Black Album would go on to be one of the most influential metal albums ever written, at a time when grunge and groove metal were killing off thrash acts that refused to get with the times. Would bands like Nickelback, 3 Days Grace, or Godsmack even exist today without the Black Album, regardless of how you feel about these 3 giant bands and more? They never fell behind, instead staying one step ahead of everyone else. But all this started with them as nothing but little shithead teens trying to build on what their predecessors did with metal. And that really hit home for a lot of kids, which brings us to key number 2. They've always been down to earth and relatable and basically drama-free, which is why they had no choice but to unfortunately kick out Dave Mustaine, because until these last few years, he was the complete opposite of all 3 of those things. Metal has never been, and probably never will be, the cool kids' music, and a lot of us metalheads find ourselves as outcasts in those high school days. And this made Metallica super relatable because they were seen as outcasts in the music scene. And this may be hard to believe in 2022, but people viewed Metallica the way black metal or death metal is viewed today. They were the underground of the underground, and they spoke directly to their fans. Whenever they played Whiplash live, they would change the lyrics to "We'll never stop, we'll never quit, because you're Metallica." And they do that even to this day. They've never taken their fame for granted, even when they weren't famous. People think Metallica shot into the mainstream when they released the Black Album, but this definitely is not the case. They started seeing mainstream success and appeal as soon as Ride the Lightning dropped. I mean, they played with Bon Jovi for a 70,000 person audience, and not to mention Day on the Green in 1985, which had 60,000 attendees. And let's not forget that One was up for a Grammy in 1989. And Master of Puppets released at number 29 on the charts, and Justice went platinum only 9 weeks after its release. And Justice wasn't some poser, typical mainstream music. Like I said earlier, this was their heaviest and most progressive album yet. They were a huge success way before the Black Album, and despite the success early on, they never rested on their laurels. They never became complacent or cocky or arrogant, and they basically had the same lineup for 40 years, where other bands in their scene would rinse and throw out musicians like used dishcloth. Metallica is pretty even-keeled as a band, keeping the drama low and cleaning themselves up when there are problems, as they did recently in 2019 when Papa Het unfortunately relapsed into his alcohol addiction. The band basically dropped everything to get behind their man and support him, as they do with their fans all the time, providing charity and meet and greets with less fortunate fans on top of their already expansive and enormous shows of appreciation of their fan base. These dudes never take anything for granted, and they give it all back when they can. For instance, their latest release, which is remastered and remade version of the Black Album with tons of different artists from genres spreading across the musical spectrum, had all its proceeds donated to their All Within My Hands Foundation, a charity that funds local community colleges and helps mitigate hunger across America. And all of this talk about their recent musical collaborations leads me to key number 3 on why Metallica was so massively more popular than every other band in metal. And it's because they took risks where other metal bands wouldn't. Shit on Metallica all you want for selling out in the 90s, but let me ask you, where are a vast majority of other thrash bands from that time? That's right, they're completely irrelevant because they refused to get with the times, they refused to face the trends, they refused to grow with their audience. Metallica saw the writing on the wall when grunge music started to explode in the 90s, and they knew that in order to remain relevant, they would have to try something new, take risks, and find ways to, again, innovate their sound. If Load and Reload would have been released by any other rock band, they'd be hailed as hard rock masterpieces. But because they came from a band that were once kings of the underground, it's seen as a terrible failure and a sad shell of the former metal masters. But these albums still contain some of Metallica's most popular and best songs. Are you really gonna sit there and tell me that the Outlaw Torn isn't an absolute masterpiece of music? Apart from releasing more hard rock oriented music to fit with the times, they released a full album of their songs played live with an orchestra. It's arguably their best album, and its beauty is almost unrivaled in metal, not to mention music as a wider whole. And like I previously mentioned, they've never shied away from collaborating with artists from other genres. Most of the metal community looks down on normie music with their noses turned up. And it's like, yeah, our music is definitely better than 90% of the other music that's out there. But that doesn't mean we can't learn from other music. That doesn't mean we can't take inspiration from other music, because there's a fantastic amount of music out there outside of metal, even in the mainstream. And this is one reason why metal bands never make it as far as Metallica did. They think that they're too good to share ideas or take inspiration from normie music, from mainstream music. Meanwhile, Metallica always took that risk and even released a cover album in the 90s of a bunch of music that inspired them. Some of these bands were popular and some of them weren't, but they were never ashamed of putting their tastes and inspirations out there. For real, all you need to do is look at Gary Holt and his cringeworthy Kill the Kardashians t-shirt, and that is a clear explanation of why metal bands are never going to be as big as Metallica. They've shared the stage with Lady Gaga and Lou Reed and Queen and Miley Cyrus and Billie Eilish and Coldplay, among others. They produced their own full-length theatrical movie, whose filming I happen to be at, and their own video game, and even their own fantastic whiskey. Hey, it's 5 o'clock somewhere. And if the fruits of their risk-taking reach is ever in question, their previously mentioned mega collaboration release of the Black Album shows that their influence has spread across so many genres that any other metal band would have never reached. This isn't selling out. This is taking risks and identifying cultural trends so you can stay relevant as a band and a media property. And this quote from Lars Ulrich during the making of Through the Never perfectly sums up everything that I have been saying in this video.
Increasingly, in order for Metallica to be the best at what we do and continue to do whatever it is we do for another 30 years, we have to peek into these other worlds. We have to make ourselves vulnerable We know what we do so well, and you always live in fear of taking it for granted. You always live in the shadow of ending up on autopilot. And when you throw yourself out into these kind of endeavors, you're not on autopilot, you're not taking it for granted. And ultimately, to me, that's the Metallica way, that's what we do.
All right, that's my argument. So what do you think? Did Metallica sell out in the 90s, or do people just love to hate on whatever's popular because of this crab bucket mentality within metal music? I want to hear what you have to say down below. And of course, if you haven't yet, go down below, sauce me one of these bad boys, smash that subscribe button for me. Again, it really helps me out, really helps bring more fantastic content to you awesome metalheads and your absolutely perfect taste in music. Until next time, everybody, long live metal.